सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Denis Manturov, a Russian Deputy Prime Minister, but more importantly, also Minister for Industry and Trade. He's been in India. We've seen a bunch of Russian dignitaries coming to New Delhi. We had Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, just some time back. Now, Denis Manturov. And he held up the mirror to all of us Indians. Now, I'm not saying it's a rude mirror or funny mirror, but it's a fact-check mirror. It's a fact-check mirror. It's also a reality check mirror. It might be a bit rude, though, to those in our country who are now fantasizing about a BRICS currency or a new currency or a liberation, quote-unquote liberation from the dollar. How you are slaves to the dollar, I don't know. But liberation from the dollar, to which the obvious question is, if liberation from the dollar, so what do you go into? So one, there is a fantasy that there will be a BRICS currency, and we talked about this a little while back, a few days back, where we said BRICS is not a political, geostrategic, geographic, economic, ethnic entity, right? BRICS is just an acronym. That said, again, what is the next alternative if you are getting rid of the dollar, or if you are, quote unquote, liberating yourself from the dollar? So what do you do if you get rid of the dollar? If you liberate yourselves of the dollar, where do you go? A BRICS currency, if it's not going to work, then are you going to go into the Chinese yuan? Obviously, there will be no public opinion in India, no matter how anti-Western and anti-American and anti-dollar it tends to be. But nobody wants to go into the Chinese yuan as our currency for international trade. So what else do you do? Arey, what's wrong with the rupee? Use the rupee. See the Russians. We are buying our oil from Russians in rupee. Now, there are many elaborate things being done to buy the oil from Russians. Sometimes the UAE dirham comes in, which in turn is also linked to the dollar. So you might say that I'm converting my rupee into UAE dirham and paying the Russians, but the fact is that UAE dirham also is pegged to the dollar. That's why the conversion rate of UAE dirham to the dollar always remains the same. That said, what about this fantasy of the rupee? Fantasy of, first, chota fantasy of the BRICS currency, which is not going to happen for 20 reasons. And then the bigger fantasy of the rupee becoming a global currency, or rupee becoming the currency in which India trades with the world. So look at some data. So my colleague and our data journalist, Nikhil Rampal, has pulled out some data. In fact, he was working on his story, but I've stolen it from him. I've pulled rank on him and I've stolen his data. And I'm sharing this data with you. You will see his story in a couple of days because he's getting some more data and some more facts. It will be quite a story. Now, before you see the data, see what did Manturov say. And why do I say that he held up the mirror to us? He held up the mirror to us, which is a fact-check mirror. It's a rude mirror to those who fantasize about a BRICS currency or the Indian rupee becoming an international currency or currency in which India trades with the world, or because there is a big problem there, as Manturov pointed out. So what did Manturov say? Manturov said, look, payments is an issue. He said, fantastic. India-Russia trade has now boomed. It used to be very small. Now it's going up to about, he said it's gone up upwards of $35 billion. Actually, it's about $39 billion right now and rising. And we know the reason. It's a three-letter reason, OIL, oil. But the trade is $39 billion. He says the trade has gone up a lot. That's a very good thing. But, and I quote him now, but payments is an issue. And then he goes on to say lack of imports from India is not enough to use the rupees. That is, if India buys this oil from Russia in rupees and India pays the Russians these rupees, what does Russia do with these rupees? Because Russians simply do not buy enough from India. In fact, at this point, they buy not even 10% of what they export to India. So there is a trade surplus built in their favor, which is more than upwards of 90%, I would say 92 to 93% of their exports to India. So if India has bought all that stuff, all oil from Russia in rupees. Where does Russia take those rupees? Now, they can come to India and buy something, but what is it that they will buy for that kind of money? That's what he's complaining about or is worrying about. So he goes on to say, we need to increase Indian imports so we have balance. For example, with China, we have $200 billion trade, but it's balanced 50-50, right? So which means there might be a little surplus in favor of China as I look at the data, but it's nearly 50-50. This year, because China is also importing a lot of oil from Russia, the deficit has now narrowed and the trade is almost balanced between Russia and China, not quite between Russia and India. Then he goes on to say, and I will share the link of this story with you, and also you will find this text running on your screens. And then he goes on to say, and I quote, we sell more than we purchase. So to purchase more from India, not just raw material or traditional agricultural products, we are more interested in cooperation in machinery. And India today is a country with sophisticated machinery production. We are interested in this cooperation with our knowledge and India's manufacturing facilities. And he goes on saying some sweet stuff about India, because after all, how do you come to India and say that, look, you are buying so much stuff from me, I'm buying so little from you, and then you want to pay me in rupee, and I don't know what to do with this rupee because I don't think your currency is worth anything whereby I can go and buy something with this currency from countries other than your own. Now, what Manturov has done is he's broken both the myths. So first is the myth of trading with BRICS country in a BRICS currency or Indian currency. So look at the situation of our trade with BRICS, and this is data that Nikhil has put together. Look at our deficit with BRICS. We've always had a deficit in our trade with BRICS countries, and that's where you see the first chart. The first chart tells you, and we are going back to 2010. You can go further back if you so wish, but 2010 I think is a good enough cutoff point. So in 2010, for example, our total deficit with BRICS countries, BRICS mein I is India, so take that out. So Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa. Our total deficit was about $22 billion. Then see this graph, and then you see how this graph rises. This graph rises in a negative way for India. That's why it's rising sort of upside down, right? But you see how it rises relentlessly. So almost every year, barring one odd year, maybe 2013, every year this deficit is increasing. So what was about $23 billion in 2010 has now become $120 plus billion. In fact, at this point, it is $122 billion. So $122 billion is our total deficit with BRICS countries. If that is the case, in which BRICS currency are we going to do trade with the rest of the BRICS countries? Again, you want to understand this better? Look at this second graphic. This is a straightforward line graphic. If you see the line graphic, again, 2010, you're beginning at about $22 billion. That's your deficit, trade deficit with BRICS. And then see how this is rising. It goes like this. Maybe then 1 year, 2019-20, it comes down. But that is logical because 2020 was the year of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And then see how it's gone up vertically. It's just shot up vertically like this. And it's now gone to $122 billion. That is the deficit right now. And that is the big reality check. And that is something that Manturov has pointed out to us in his own very polite way. Now you want to see this in more granular detail? Look at this third chart. What this third chart tells you is how India's trade deficit with China and Russia has widened in 2022. Once again, take a close look at the chart. I have it in my hands, but you have it on your screen. Take a close look at the chart. What this tells you is the comparison between 2021 and 2022. Again, in different colors, you have exports and imports for the 2 years. Now, look at exports. Our exports to China, and I will give you the precise figures in a minute. Our exports to China have fallen between 2021 and 22. And then you can see the other countries also. Generally, our exports haven't done that much better. If you look at Russia, for example, marginally our exports may have fallen. I'll give you the details in a bit. Then you look to the other side, that is imports, and see that Manhattan to begin with, as the cricket commentators call the overs or runs per over, right? So the Manhattan begins right at the very beginning because that's where China features. And then there is another chota size skyscraper with Russia. So this is also a telling graphic. It tells you how much our deficit with China has risen and how much our deficit with Russia has risen. So in this case, this is just a chart showing how your import from these countries has risen between 2021 and 22, and then you juxtapose that with your export figure on the other side, and you get the full picture, and you get the picture of the imbalance and inequality that exists there. Because for anything to become a common currency between countries like these, there will have to be some parity in trade. You cannot be having a deficit everywhere. You cannot be running such a huge deficit and then be trading with a common currency there. Or definitely you could not be trading in the Chinese currency, because China is the leading surplus party, trade surplus party in this grouping, in the grouping of BRICS. China has a huge surplus with India. In fact, about 13 to 14% of all of China's trade surplus now comes from trade with India. That is 1 in 7 or maybe 1 in $8. I think more likely $1 in $7 of trade surplus that China has with the entire world comes from India, and generally with others as well, because China is a big trading power. If you see that, you can also look at some basic data. If you look at BRICS, with BRICS, our deficit in 2021 was 73.3 billion. Now it's gone to about 122 billion. That's an increase of nearly 64%. 64% in 1 year. Obviously, most of it is attributable to the oil imports from Russia, and I will give you that data also. But once again, the picture is not pretty for us. So this is the data on deficit. But if you look at imports, in 2021, our imports from BRICS countries were $112 billion. In 2022, they've risen to $156 billion. That's a rise of 36%. Those are our imports from BRICS countries. And what's happened to our exports? Hold your breath. Our exports in 2021 were $38.6 billion. This year, they are down to $35.9 billion. So if anything, our exports have fallen. They've fallen by 7%. Again, not a good picture. In fact, the tough truth is that ever since BRICS came into being, the BRICS formulation became a reality or became a thing, India has never had a surplus with BRICS countries. In fact, even individually, India has never had surplus with Russia, South Africa, China. Occasionally, as you might have seen on my earlier chart, India does have, in fact, if you see the chart of our rising trade deficit, you will find a little sliver of green here and there. That is about Brazil. So occasionally we might have a tiny surplus with Brazil, but not otherwise. Again, you want to see imports from Russia. Imports from Russia in 2021 were just $8.5 billion. I suspect a lot of it was spares for our weapon systems, or maybe some missiles, rockets, some ammunition, or maybe the early payments for the S-400 missile system and things like that. But it was $8.5 billion only. 2022, it's become $35.5 billion. That's an increase of more than 300%. Now we know that you know, and all of us know that this has happened because of oil. But once again, what happens if you pay for all this oil in rupee? What will the Russians do with that rupee? And in the same period, and again, it's not a pretty picture, our exports to Russia have actually fallen. They've fallen from a meager $3.32 billion in 2021 to $2.9 billion, only $2.9 billion in 2022. That's a fall of 12%, which means we built a huge trade deficit with Russia also now, and this trade deficit is widening. Our exports to China at the same time have fallen 34% this year, from just 24 billion to 15 billion, whereas our imports have risen from 88 billion to 103 billion, and that produces a deficit of nearly $88 billion as we calculate in India. But if you look at the Chinese Customs Department's data, I would find that to be a more realistic picture, because that would put the deficit at just a little over $100 billion, for the simple reason, as this link from the IMF that I will share with you, that explains to you, many countries, when they put their export data, they also add the cost of freight, insurance, etc., because that's also added to the value of goods they are exporting. But countries when they're accounting for imports, as India does, they exclude that. So if you take that, then our deficit with China is upwards of $100 billion that year. In this situation now, to do trade with other countries in rupee is a near impossibility, because that would become like barter trade. And that will only work if you have to give to other countries something that those countries need desperately, like say oil in India. China and Russia do not see anything that India produces that they need so desperately that they will buy it with rupees. So China will not sell goods to India in rupees because they don't know what to do with them. Russia, even if they were to sell to us in rupees, will not know what to do with them. So some way will have to be found. Even if they start importing a bit more from India, if India paid for the oil in rupee, all this oil in rupee, it's not happening. Even if India pays for all this oil in rupee, the Russians will not know what to do with that rupee. So that takes out the rupee question. Now, let me conclude by coming to the dollar question. So why this big, strong sentiment, this big emotion, nationalistic fervor to liberate ourselves of the dollar? To liberate ourselves of the dollar and go to the BRICS system, go to a system where we have humongous trade deficits. In fact, economically, at this point, India has almost the relationship of a colony with China, because a colonial power imports raw materials from you, adds value, and creates its own value-added products and sells them to you at high price. So why would India want to go to that system and to rebel and break away from that part of the system which seems to be working well for India? Look at India's trade with three particular entities. That's the US, EU, all of Europe, and UK. These are the three major trading partners with which India has today and has traditionally had healthy trade surpluses. So if you look at the US, exports are $80 billion, imports are $51 billion. India enjoys a surplus of $28.5 billion with the US. Wow. Were you conscious of that? EU, exports are $73.7 billion. Imports are $57.8 billion. India has a surplus of $15.8 billion. UK, just one country, exports are $11.2 billion. Imports are $9.5 billion. So the trade surplus is $1.7 billion. So you can do your own sums if you wish. Our trade surplus with the US, $28.5 billion, EU, $15.8 billion, plus UK, $1.7. That makes a neat $45 billion. Now, you want to break away from a system, whether you like the currency or not, where you have a surplus of $45 billion and go into another system where you have a deficit of $122 billion. You need to be out of your minds. And you know what? We also need a little explanation as to what is it that these Western powers, quote unquote, evil Western powers are buying from us, giving us this surplus, which the Chinese and the Russians don't. These are our soft exports. You can call them software, you can call them services. So India's services are our export powerhouse, our export engine. That is what these Western countries, Western economies need, and they are buying from us. And that is not something that the Russians or the Chinese have any need for. And that's where this relationship of inequality comes in. And that's why I'm so touched by this emotion, which I might call irrational, where a lot of people want to break away from a system where India is such a strong beneficiary and go into another system which is almost like the colonial equivalent of a trading equation.